I want to tell you what happens when a physicist reads the Bible, not a hostile physicist looking for ammunition, not a devout physicist looking for confirmation, just a physicist, someone who has spent their career learning to read descriptions of the physical world carefully, to notice what predictions they make, to check those predictions against what we actually observe. What happens is this. You find a document that is in many ways extraordinary, remarkable literature in places, profound moral insight in others, a record of human thought and experience that spans centuries and cultures and languages, a document that shaped the lives of billions of people, and continues to do so, and embedded throughout this extraordinary document are specific claims about the physical world, about how the universe was created and in what order, about what happened to a global population in a flood, about how human languages came to exist, about what happens to populations subject to specific ecological disruptions, about what a human being can survive inside a large marine animal, about how long human beings used to live. These are physical claims. They make specific predictions about the physical world that are either correct or incorrect. And a physicist reading them has to check, not out of disrespect, out of respect, the same respect you'd give any claim about the physical world, the respect of taking it seriously enough to evaluate it. So, I want to take 6 of these claims and evaluate them, carefully, honestly, with the tools we have. And I want to tell you in advance what I'm going to find, not because I want to spoil the analysis, but because I think transparency is more honest than manufactured suspense. I'm going to find that the Bible is wrong about the physics, not in every claim, not about everything it addresses, but in the specific physical claims I'm going to examine. The physics says something different from what the text says. That's not the end of the story about what the Bible is or what it means, but it's an important part of the story, and it deserves to be said clearly. Let's start at the beginning. Genesis 1 verse 1, 6 claims, 6 physics tests. 1. The Genesis creation sequence. What came first, second, third, and what the cosmological record says about the actual order. 2. The flood hydrology, where the water came from, where it went, and what the geology of the planet says about a global inundation. 3. The Tower of Babel and linguistic physics, how languages actually diverge, what the time scale is, and what Babel requires language to do that it doesn't do. 4. The Exodus plagues, the specific ecological and epidemiological physics of 10 sequential disasters, and why the natural explanation is both more interesting and more problematic for the miracle claim than most people realize. 5. Jonah and the physiology of 3 days inside a large marine animal, gastric acid, oxygen, pressure, and what those mean for survival. 6. The patriarchal ages, Methuselah at 969 years, Noah at 950, and what biology says about why those numbers are there, and what they actually mean. 6 claims. Let's check them. Genesis 1 describes the creation of the universe in 6 days. The sequence as described goes like this. Day 1, light is created, evening and morning, dark and light separated. Day 2, the firmament is created, separating the waters above from the waters below. The sky is formed. Day 3, dry land appears, seas are gathered, plants are created, grass, seed-bearing plants, fruit trees. Day 4, the sun, moon, and stars are created, placed in the firmament to give light and mark seasons. Day 5, sea creatures and birds are created. Day 6, land animals and humans are created. Now, I want to compare this to what physics and cosmology tell us about the actual sequence of events in the universe's history. The universe began approximately 13.8 billion years ago with the Big Bang. For the first 380 years, the universe was too hot and dense for atoms to form. It was a plasma of particles. Then, as it cooled, hydrogen and helium atoms formed and light was released for the first time. This is the cosmic microwave background, the oldest light we can detect. So, light came first. In that sense, Genesis gets the first step right. Day 1, light is actually consistent with the physics, but then it goes wrong almost immediately. Day 2 in Genesis. The firmament is created, the sky, the separation of waters above from waters below. This is a description of a flat earth model with a solid dome above it. And water above the dome. The waters above the firmament are the conceptual explanation for where rain comes from. It seeps through the dome from the ocean above. This model is specifically wrong. There is no firmament. There is no ocean above the sky. The sky is a column of atmosphere, not a solid dome. Day 3. Plants appear. But in the actual sequence of events, the Earth itself formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago, long before any plants. And the first plants appeared approximately 700 million years ago. They did not appear before the sun. Which brings us to day 4. Day 4 in Genesis. The sun, moon, and stars are created, after the plants. But the sun formed approximately 4.6 billion years ago, before the earth, before any plants. The stars are older still. Some have been burning for 10 to 12 billion years. The claim that stars were created after plants is not just slightly wrong. It's wrong by billions of years. This is the specific sequence error that I find most striking. Plants require sunlight to grow through photosynthesis. The Genesis account creates plants on day 3, and then creates the sun on day 4. Plants cannot grow before the sun exists. The sequence violates basic biology and astrophysics simultaneously. Day 5. Sea creatures and birds. The actual sequence. Marine life appeared approximately 540 million years ago in the Cambrian explosion. Birds are much later. They evolved from theropod dinosaurs approximately 150 million years ago. And critically, fish, marine vertebrates, appear in the fossil record before birds. The Genesis sequence of sea creatures and birds appearing together on the same day, and appearing before land animals, is roughly consistent with the fossil record in broad strokes. Day 6. Land animals and humans, broadly consistent. Humans did appear after most other land animals. So, the Genesis sequence gets some things right. Light first. Marine life before land animals. Humans last among the animals. These are things an observant Bronze Age author might plausibly infer from the natural world. But it gets specific things dramatically wrong. The sun after the plants, the firmament and the waters above the sky. The specific time scales. All of it compressed into 6 days rather than billions of years. The partial accuracy is actually more interesting than either complete accuracy or complete error would be. It tells you something about how the text was written, by careful observers of the natural world, who got the broad strokes of sequence from observation, but didn't have the tools to get the physics of the mechanism. They got what observation can give you without instruments. The rest they filled in with the best models they had, and the models, reasonable as they were for their time, were wrong. The Genesis flood narrative describes a global inundation, not a regional flood, a global one. Genesis 7:19-20 is specific. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. 15 cubits is approximately 7 m. The text says the mountains were covered, The highest mountain on Earth is Everest at 8,849 m. The text requires water to have covered Everest. Let's do the hydrology. Earth's total water, all the oceans, all the ice caps, all the groundwater, all the water vapor in the atmosphere amounts to approximately 1,386 billion cubic kilometers. To cover Everest, you need to add enough water to raise the global sea level by approximately 8,849 m, roughly 85 km above current sea level. The surface area of the Earth is approximately 510 million square kilometers. To raise sea level by 85 km uniformly, you would need approximately 510 million x 85 to have 5 billion cubic kilometers of water. Earth currently has 1,386 billion cubic kilometers of water. You need approximately 5 billion more. Where does it come from? Genesis has an answer. Genesis 7:11 says the fountains of the great deep were broken open, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Water came from underground reservoirs and from above. Let's evaluate the underground reservoir claim first. Earth's crust and mantle do contain water bound in minerals, in hydrated rocks, and pockets of groundwater. The total amount of water in Earth's mantle is estimated at approximately 1 to 2 times the volume of the current oceans. So, roughly 1 to 2 billion cubic kilometers. Even if every drop of water locked in the mantle were released simultaneously to the surface, an event that would require the simultaneous melting and outgassing of the entire crust, which would be a geological catastrophe of completely different character from a flood, you'd get roughly double the current ocean volume, which would raise sea levels by perhaps a factor of 2. Not the factor of 4 to 5 needed to cover Everest. Now, the rainfall. Genesis says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. To deliver 5 billion cubic kilometers of water via rainfall in 40 days means delivering approximately 112 million cubic kilometers of water per day. That is approximately 100 times more water than currently exists in Earth's entire atmosphere. Even if the entire atmosphere were water vapor, even if there were no nitrogen, no oxygen, no other gases, and it all precipitated as rain simultaneously, you'd get roughly 25 cubic kilometers of water in 40 days. That's 1 million cubic kilometers, not 5 billion. The physics of the atmosphere does not permit the rainfall described. And then there's the problem of where the water went. Genesis 8:1 says God caused a wind to blow and the water receded. Where did 5 billion cubic kilometers of water go? Back into the ground, into the sky. Neither is physically possible at that scale without leaving an overwhelming geological record. We have extensive geological records of Earth's surface. We see evidence of ancient floods, regional floods of extraordinary size. We see evidence of the filling of the Black Sea basin, possibly the origin of some flood narratives. We see glacial lake outburst floods that reshaped landscapes dramatically. What we do not see is the global geological signature of a worldwide inundation at any point in the last few 100,000 years. The sediment layers, the erosion patterns, the chemical signatures that a flood of Noahic scale would leave everywhere and in unmistakable form. The geology has been examined with extraordinary care. The global flood is not in the geological record. The flood narrative, taken as a global physical event, requires approximately 3 times more water than exists on or near Earth's surface, rainfall rates that exceed the physical capacity of atmosphere by a factor of thousands, and a subsequent disappearance of that water with no geological trace. The physics doesn't permit it. Genesis 11 describes a moment when all of humanity spoke a single language. They began building a tower to reach the heavens. God, concerned about what humans might accomplish with a common language, confused their speech, giving them different languages, and scattered them across the earth. This is the biblical explanation for why humans speak different languages. I want to examine this claim using what we know about how languages actually work and how they actually diverge. Languages change. This is not a controversial observation. It is something you can see in your own lifetime. The English spoken in the 14th century is barely recognizable to a modern English speaker. The Latin spoken in ancient Rome diverged over centuries into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and the other Romance languages. The Proto-Indo-European language spoken approximately 5,000-6,000 years ago diverged over millennia into Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Persian, Germanic, Slavic, and dozens of other language families. Linguists have developed tools for measuring language divergence. The method of glottochronology uses the rate at which basic vocabulary words change to estimate when two related languages last shared a common ancestor. The method has limitations. It's not as precise as, say, atomic dating, but it gives order of magnitude estimates that are consistent with archaeological and genetic evidence. What does linguistic science tell us about the origin of language diversity? The major language families of the world diverge from each other tens of thousands of years ago, not in a sudden event, but gradually over the millennia that humans spread across the globe from Africa. Proto-Indo-European diverged from related families perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. The split between the Afroasiatic, Niger, Congo, Nilo, Saharan, and other African language families is much older, possibly 50,000 years or more. The linguistic evidence is consistent with a gradual divergence of human languages over tens of thousands of years as populations separated geographically and their speech drifted apart without contact. This is not what Babel describes. Babel describes a sudden, recent, miraculous event. One moment, all people speak one language. The next moment, God introduces multiple distinct languages simultaneously, and people who could previously communicate can no longer do so. This requires something that linguistics has no mechanism for: the simultaneous creation of multiple mutually unintelligible language systems introduced into existing populations without any preceding period of gradual divergence. Languages don't work that way. Every language we know of is related to other languages, descended from earlier languages through gradual change. Every language family shows the signs of evolutionary divergence from earlier forms. There is no language on Earth that appears to have been spontaneously created at a specific moment. Every language has a history. Furthermore, if all humans shared a single language at the time of Babel, dated by biblical chronology to approximately 4,000 years ago, a few generations after the flood, then all existing languages should be traceable to a single ancestral language from that time. But the language families of the world clearly diverge from each other far earlier than 4,000 years ago. Australian Aboriginal languages have been separated from other language groups for perhaps 50,000 years. Native American languages represent migrations across the Bering Land Bridge perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. These languages could not have shared a common ancestor 4,000 years ago. The linguistic record contradicts the Babel narrative not in small ways, but fundamentally. Languages diverge gradually over tens of thousands of years. They do not appear suddenly from divine intervention. And the timeline of divergence is completely inconsistent with a single language moment anywhere near the period the biblical chronology places Babel. The physics, the specific, measurable, scientifically established physics of how languages change says Babel didn't happen. The Genesis sequence puts the sun after the plants. The flood requires 3 times Earth's total water and leaves no geological trace. And Babel requires languages to have diverged 0 years ago when the evidence says 0 0. The next 3 claims are the ones I find most scientifically interesting. The plagues, Jonah, and the patriarchal ages all have surprising physics that most people have never heard. Subscribe, back in 30 seconds. Now, here is something I genuinely find interesting, and I want to tell you why. The 10 plagues of Exodus are presented as miraculous interventions, supernatural acts of God against Egypt to compel Pharaoh to release the Israelites. Each plague is presented as a direct divine act. But there is a significant body of scientific work, primarily from volcanologists, epidemiologists, and ecologists, arguing that the 10 plagues, in their specific sequence, are consistent with a natural cascade triggered by a single initiating event, possibly a volcanic eruption at the island of Thura in the Aegean around 1600 BC. Let me walk through the cascade. Plague 1, water turned to blood, the Nile running red. This is consistent with a bloom of burgundy blood algae, Oscillatoria rubescens, triggered by warming waters, volcanic ash input changing water chemistry, or other environmental stressors. The algae produces red pigment and toxins that kill fish. Plague 2, frogs. When the Nile becomes toxic from the algal bloom, frogs flee the water onto land. This is documented behavior. Frogs evacuate toxic water bodies. Plague 3, gnats and lice. With frogs dead on the land from dehydration and the absence of their aquatic habitat, the populations of insects that frogs normally control explode. Gnats, lice, and similar insects proliferate. Plague 4, flies. More insects, now including flies, spreading across the landscape. Plague 5, livestock disease. The flies carry bacteria and diseases that infect livestock. Specifically, the scenario is consistent with African horse sickness or similar vector diseases spread by the now abundant insect population. Plague 6, boils. Skin infections in humans spread by the same insect vectors that infected livestock. Plague 7, hail. Extreme weather events are associated with major volcanic eruptions. The Thura eruption produced climate disruptions across the eastern Mediterranean. Plague 8, locusts. Locust swarms are triggered by specific weather conditions, including the kind of unusual rainfall patterns that follow major volcanic and climate disruptions. Plague 9, darkness. Volcanic ash clouds from the Thura eruption could have produced extended periods of reduced sunlight over Egypt. Plague 10, death of the firstborn. This is the hardest to explain naturally and remains the most contested. Some researchers have proposed that mycotoxins from fungal growth on grain stores, grain stored in pits where fungal contamination concentrates, would affect those who ate from the top of the grain stores first, which in ancient practice was often the head of household or firstborn. Others suggest contaminated water settling in low-lying areas where the youngest children slept. Now, here is the specific scientific problem this creates for the miracle interpretation. If the 10 plagues are a natural ecological cascade, each one following from the previous one through normal environmental processes. Then the miraculous interpretation requires God to have engineered a natural cascade rather than performing 10 separate supernatural interventions. This is a less miraculous God than the one who simply commands each plague directly. It is a God who set up a domino sequence. And more importantly, if the plagues have a natural explanation, the natural explanation is preferable by Occam's razor. We don't need to invoke divine intervention to explain an ecological cascade that follows from a volcanic eruption. The cascade is what ecology predicts, and if the plagues have a natural explanation, they are not evidence of divine intervention. They are evidence of a severe environmental disaster that the authors of Exodus interpreted through a theological lens. The science doesn't prove the plagues didn't happen. It provides a natural mechanism for them. A natural mechanism removes the need for a miraculous explanation. The most famous miracles in the Old Testament may be the most natural. I find that genuinely interesting, not because it disproves God, it doesn't, but because it shows how the same events look completely different through a theological lens and a scientific one, and how the theological interpretation adds nothing to the explanation that the scientific one doesn't already provide. The book of Jonah tells a story in which the prophet Jonah is swallowed by a great fish, variously translated as a whale, and remains inside it for 3 days and 3 nights before being vomited onto dry land alive. This claim has a specific biological content. It describes a human being surviving inside a large marine animal for approximately 72 hours. Let me examine what the biology of that situation actually involves. First, species. Whales are the obvious candidate. They're large enough. Sperm whales can be up to 20 m long and have a throat large enough to swallow a large squid whole. Other candidates include whale sharks, basking sharks, or other large marine animals. For purposes of the physics, let's consider a sperm whale since it's the most plausible candidate. The sperm whale's digestive system begins with a 4-chambered stomach. The first chamber, the forostomach, functions as a holding area and does not produce digestive acid. Food passes relatively slowly through the whale's digestive system. So far, not immediately fatal. A person inside the forostomach would not be dissolved immediately by stomach acid. But here is the oxygen problem. The interior of a whale's stomach is essentially anaerobic, very low in oxygen. Air, breathing animals, including humans, require oxygen to survive. An adult human at rest consumes approximately 25 L of oxygen per minute. A whale's forostomach, sealed and containing whatever air was swallowed with the prey, contains a limited quantity of oxygen. Even if Jonah's swallowing was accompanied by a significant gulp of air, the oxygen supply would last a matter of minutes to perhaps an hour, not 72 hours. But let's say the anaerobic environment could somehow be survived. Let's consider what else is happening. Temperature. The interior of a whale's body is maintained at approximately 36-37 degrees C, similar to human body temperature. This is not immediately lethal. Pressure. Sperm whales dive to extraordinary depths, up to 30 m, in search of giant squid. At 30 m, the pressure is approximately 300 atmospheres. The nitrogen dissolved in a human body under that pressure would, upon surfacing, come out of solution and form bubbles in the bloodstream, the same mechanism that causes decompression sickness in human divers, which is frequently fatal. Even if the whale didn't dive during the 3 days, the pressure at shallower depths would cause physiological distress. Gastric acid. While the forest stomach may not produce strong acid, the whale's digestive process does involve acid further along. The environment is not neutral, and there is the question of what happened over 72 hours without food, without water to drink. Ocean salt water would cause dehydration, and in complete darkness with no sensory reference points. The conclusion from the physiology is specific. A human being inside a large marine animal for 72 hours faces oxygen deprivation within minutes to an hour, pressure effects during any diving, gradual dehydration, and a complete absence of breathable air after the initial supply is exhausted. Survival for 72 hours is not impossible as a miracle claim. Miracles by definition override physics, but it is impossible as a natural event. There is no biological mechanism by which a human survives those conditions for that duration. Now, some theologians interpret Jonah as allegory rather than historical narrative. That's a reasonable position. But for those who insist on the literal historicity of the text, and many do, the physiology is unambiguous. 3 days inside a whale is not survivable, not even close. Genesis 5 lists the genealogy from Adam to Noah with the ages of each patriarch at the time they fathered their significant sons and at the time of their deaths. Adam lived 930 years, Seth lived 912 years, Enosh lived 905 years, Methuselah, the longest lived, reached 969 years. Noah lived 950 years. These are the numbers in the text, and I want to do 2 things with them. First, examine whether they're biologically possible. Second, and more interestingly, consider what they might actually mean historically. The biology first. Maximum human lifespan is determined by cellular and molecular mechanisms: telomere shortening, DNA damage accumulation, protein misfolding, tissue senescence. The mechanisms are well understood at a qualitative level and increasingly at a quantitative level. The current verified record for human longevity is 122 years and 164 days, held by Jean Calment of France, who died in 1997. No verified human lifespan has exceeded 123 years in the modern era. The biological processes that limit lifespan, the ones that make cells accumulate damage and eventually stop dividing correctly, are not historically recent. They are conserved across mammalian species. They were operating the same way 0 years ago as they do now. There is no biological mechanism that would have allowed a human being 0 years ago to live 10 times longer than the oldest person alive today. The claim that people routinely live to 900+ years requires either that human biology was fundamentally different than in ways that left no trace, no skeletal evidence, no genetic trace, no physiological evidence of any kind, or that the numbers mean something other than what they appear to mean. And here is the more interesting question: what do they actually mean? Biblical scholars have noted for a long time that the pattern of extremely long lifespans in Genesis is not unique to the Hebrew Bible. The Sumerian king list, a Mesopotamian document predating the biblical genealogies, lists kings with reigns of thousands of years. Ululam, the first king of Sumer, is said to have reigned 28,800 years. Alalnger reigned 36,000 years. In the ancient Near Eastern literary tradition, very large numbers attached to ancient ancestors were a way of signaling their importance and antiquity, not a literal biological claim. The further back in time, the more impressive the person, the larger the numbers attached to them. There's also a compelling textual hypothesis. In ancient Hebrew, the same word, shana, is used for both year and month in some contexts. If the patriarchal years were lunar months, each shana being approximately one modern month, then Methuselah's 969 years become approximately 969 months, or about 75 modern years. That is not implausible. Enoch, who walked with God and was taken at 365 years, the number of days in a solar year, becomes approximately 30 modern years under this interpretation. The specific numerical symbolism is suggestive. The patriarchal ages are not biological records. They are numerical symbolism in a literary tradition that used large numbers to indicate importance and antiquity. The numbers were not intended to be taken literally in the biological sense. They were not a claim about human physiology. They were a literary convention that later readers took as literal history. And physics, the biology of aging and cellular senescence, says the literal history is impossible. I want to say something about the people who wrote these things, because I think they deserve more credit than they were wrong about physics. They were trying to answer the same questions physics tries to answer. Why does the universe exist? How did it come to be the way it is? Why are humans here? What is our place in the cosmos? Why do we suffer? Why do languages differ? Why do we die? These are the deepest questions, and the people who wrote the Bible were trying to answer them with the tools available to them. Observation, oral tradition, the accumulated experience of their communities, poetry, myth, the kind of reasoning that careful people do when careful people don't yet have mathematics and instruments and controlled experiments. Given those tools, they did something remarkable. They produced a cosmology, wrong in specific details, but organized around the idea that the universe has a rational structure and that human beings can understand it. They produced an ethics, whatever its flaws, containing real moral insight about how human beings should treat each other. They produced a history, not accurate as modern history, but preserving memories and cultural experiences across millennia. The specific physical claims they made were wrong because they didn't have physics yet, not because they were stupid, not because they weren't trying, because physics was not yet a thing human beings had figured out how to do. The Bible is what you get when very serious, very intelligent people try to answer the hardest questions without the tools that would eventually make those questions answerable. And I find that genuinely, without condescension, worth respecting, not as a physics textbook, as a record of the human attempt to understand. Let me say what the 6 analyses add up to. The Genesis sequence puts the sun after the plants, billions of years after in reality. The flood requires 3 times Earth's water supply and leaves no geological trace. Babel requires language divergence to have happened 4 zeros, 0 years ago, when the evidence says 50 zeros, 0. The Exodus plagues are more interesting with a natural explanation than a miraculous one. Jonah cannot survive 3 days inside a large marine animal for biological reasons that are specific and unambiguous. And Methuselah's 969 years are a literary convention, not a biological record. 6 claims, 6 specific failures of the physical description. But here is what I want to say in closing, because I think it's the most important thing. The Bible is not wrong because it's old. Many old things are right. The mathematics of Archimedes is still true. The observations of ancient astronomers were often accurate. Age is not the problem. The Bible is wrong about physics because it was written by people who didn't have physics yet. They had something else, something that physics doesn't give you, the courage to ask the deepest questions, the persistence to record the answers, even provisional answers, and pass them down. The recognition that the universe is intelligible, and that humans are the kind of beings who can try to understand it. Those things are not nothing. In fact, they are almost everything. Physics came later. Physics refined the answers. Physics corrected the specific physical claims. But the impulse that produced the Bible, the impulse to look at the universe and say, I want to understand this. I need to understand this. I am going to try to understand this with everything I have. That impulse is not something physics replaced. It is something physics inherited, thus not an insult. That's just the history of knowledge.